And welcome to the Reason and Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by co-host William Albrecht and esteemed guest, Dr. Daniel Wallace. Dr. Wallace, how are you? It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. I've followed your work for years, so it's an honor to be, chatting and dialoguing with you here. Let me go ahead and formally introduce you, and then we're going to dive in. We're going to be talking about the reliability of the New Testament. Now, for those of y'all who are not familiar with Dr. Wallace, he is the senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, where he has taught for more than 32 years, and is the executive director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. He also graduated summa cum laude from Dallas Seminary with a PhD in New Testament studies, and has written, co-authored, edited, and contributed to more than 36 books. Dr. Wallace is an outstanding scholar with many, many more accomplishments. We could go on and on and on. So once again, Dr. Wallace, it's an honor to have you on.
Well, you're too generous, and with a resume like that, I can hardly wait to hear what I have
to say. I'm excited. I look forward to it. We had Dr. Ehrman on, and I think it's important to have others who have a different perspective on the text of the New Testament to balance it out. And so let me, since we're talking here about Dr. Ehrman, let me ask you a question that came up in the interview that we had with him. He claims that there's a substantial gap between the events of the New Testament and their recording. And so this casts doubt on their reliability. We can't really know what was originally written. And even if we can know what was originally written, that doesn't necessarily mean that that lines up with the events themselves. What would you say to that?
Well, the second part of his statement, that even if we could know what was written doesn't necessarily line up with the events, is a discussion for another time. That deals with historical criticism, whether we can trust the tradition. But, I'll address it briefly right now, very, very briefly. But then we'll look at the primary question, which has to do with textual criticism. How can we tell that what we have in our hands is actually what the apostles and their associates wrote? In terms of a historical criticism, excuse me, I just had a nice dinner, and it was a little brief.
No problem, not a problem.
One of the issues that scholars wrestle with when they think about the historical Jesus is, what are the criteria that we can use to determine whether Jesus said or did something? Now, these are criteria that historians use, whether they are Christians or not. They are the criteria that the Jesus Seminar used. All these, it's called criteria of authenticity. They had about 180 of them. Most scholars would say there's about half a dozen that are pretty solid. And even believers use this. Evangelicals will use this. So let's take, for example, the Criterion of Dissimilarity. I'll give you two criteria that I think are very significant. One is this Criterion of Dissimilarity, and it goes like this. If there's something that Jesus said that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and religious leaders of his day did not say, and if the church after this time does not say it, then it must surely go back to Jesus. Now, initially you might say, well, wait a minute, why should that go back to Jesus? I would think that's the very thing that doesn't go back to him. The point is that when you look at the historical criteria, a lot of scholars are saying, well, Jesus is saying something here that the Pharisees would say, so they just, the writers just put those words on Jesus' lips. But they don't come up, the writers don't come up with new inventions for Jesus that the church doesn't follow. So I'll give you an example. In the ancient world in the first century, when someone said amen, they said it at the end of someone else's prayer, just like we do today. Although nowadays we'll also say amen at the end of our own prayers. Jesus did something that, as far as I understand, was absolutely unique. He put amen at the beginning of his own statements. Now, he would do it, and it's never translated that way. It's translated truly or truly, truly in John's gospel, or verily, verily, or I tell you the solemn truth. I don't think truly, truly is a good translation for Jesus speaking. It sounds a little bit too effeminate. It sounds like something out of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang to me. So I think truly, I tell my students, don't go with truly, truly. Verily, verily, even though it's archaic, is a far better translation. But what is actually going on is he's saying amen, amen. Now, John's gospel doubles this. And the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have it just once at the beginning of some of Jesus' statements. But there's scores of them. Now, here's the interesting thing. What that meant in the ancient world is I not only affirm what this statement is saying, but I also am appealing to this as two witnesses speaking to God. Jesus is his own witness. He affirms his own statements, and it's an implicit argument for his own deity. Either he's the most egotistical person who's ever lived, or he is indeed God in the flesh. Okay, now that's one example. And the church, by the way, did not do that. They did not use amen at the front of their own statements. I'll give you another example. Jesus calls himself Son of Man, I believe, something like 77 times in the Gospels. This is a term that was used. It comes out of Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man is sitting on the clouds, and it's a mysterious figure. Who is this Son of Man? Now, we had in religious literature of the day, Jewish literature of the day, they spoke of a Son of Man in terms of a prophet, but not more than that. And so for Jesus to speak of himself as the Son of Man, people are saying, well, what exactly does that mean? We don't have, after Jesus says this, the early church picking up on that as a term for Jesus. And it's also not a term that the Jewish leaders of the day would be using. So consequently, it's almost surely something that Jesus adopted for himself. And even the most radical scholars would say, yeah, I have to agree that the Son of Man statements, at least some of them, are authentic. So here, this criterion of dissimilarity. Jesus says something about himself that the religious leaders on the day would not say about himself or anybody else, and the early church did not pick up on it. So when you get to the Son of Man, what's interesting is it becomes a divine figure, and it's also something that Jesus fills the meaning of. He reveals to his disciples when they are just about the furthest or the farthest they could get from Jerusalem, near Caesarea Philippi. Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And that's when, after Peter's confession, he says, "I tell you, truly, the Son of Man needs to suffer and die and then rise from the dead." And so that's when he reveals to them truly that he really is the Son of Man. And then on the journey back to Jerusalem, he explains what it means to be the Son of Man. So those are a couple of illustrations. Now, let me give you an illustration from the Criterion of Embarrassment, which is my favorite criterion. If we have in the Gospels Jesus saying or doing something that the early church would find uncomfortable, and we know about what the early church said because of what later writings we have with the epistles and apostolic fathers, church fathers, later writers like this. If it makes them uncomfortable, then if it's recorded in the Gospels, there's no way that that kind of a thing would have been invented by those gospel writers who were a part of that early Christian community. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. I'll give you three, actually. Well, just two because of time. First is Jesus' baptism. When John baptizes Jesus, we see in Mark chapter 1 that he is baptizing for the forgiveness of sins. Well, immediately that could cause the early church a number of problems. What, is Jesus a sinner? Is that what's really going on? In Matthew's gospel, in Matthew 3, you have this conversation between John and Jesus in which John says, "No, I'm the one who needs to be baptized by you, not the other way around." In Mark's gospel, he makes it far more subtle. Mark lays out in the first few verses of chapter 1 that people are coming. It tells where they're coming from, who's coming, baptized by John in the Jordan River for the forgiveness of sins. You have exactly the same parallels when it comes to Jesus, except for that last line, for the forgiveness of sins. So Mark is subtly indicating Jesus was baptized by John, but not for the same reasons. There's something about this guy that's different. And Matthew fills that out with this conversation to show that Jesus really was not a sinner. So that's the kind of a thing that everybody, and I mean everybody who believes that Jesus existed, any biblical scholars would say, yes, John baptized Jesus. It's one of these irrefutable facts. Okay, now let's go to the end of Jesus' ministry, the resurrection. Who are the first people to come to the empty tomb? It's women. In the Jewish courts of the day, women had essentially no voice. Josephus says that the testimony of 100 women would be needed to equal that of the testimony of one man. Jewish women really, they just didn't count as witnesses. They weren't considered to be reliable witnesses. These evangelists, these gospel writers, do you think that they're really going to invent women as the witnesses to the empty tomb as the very first witnesses? Unless that really happened? I mean, they're shooting themselves in the foot if they do that. Wouldn't they have somebody who's the most reliable authority possible be the witness to Jesus' resurrection? Instead, they go with something that in the culture of the day, in the Jewish culture of the day, these women's testimony would be worthless. So the evangelists who strongly, obviously, believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ are telling us something that would cut against their own grain, which means it must surely be true. And Bart Ehrman has real problems with the women at the empty tomb. He says, well, it's not really that big of a deal. One of the ways in which he deals with all this is he says all of the gospel writers are Gentiles, not Jews. Well, that's a nice, easy fix for the problem, except that he's standing on the radical left side of biblical scholarship as far as where most scholars are looking at the Gospels. So that's some of the historical criteria. Let me just take a pause here, see if you got any questions about that. And I can, the textual data.
Yeah. Now I have a question here, and it's actually one that I'm also seeing in the chat, oddly enough. Would you give priority to Mark or Matthew? Some say that, Mark was written first and that the other Gospels borrow from Mark, and others say that Matthew was written first. What's your view?
Broad consensus, but it's not as strong as it was 40, 50 years ago. The broad consensus among biblical scholars is that Mark's Gospel was the first one written. Now, there is in the Apostolic Fathers, you start with Papias, you get Irenaeus and some others who say that Papias says that Matthew wrote something. He doesn't call it the Gospel, and this has been typically overlooked by scholars. Matthew wrote the Logia Jesu, the sayings of Jesus, in Hebrew, and everybody interpreted them as best they could. This is what Papias says. Now, the sayings of Jesus, people naturally assume, well, this must mean the gospel, but he doesn't call it the gospel. Not only that, but the sayings of Jesus can be neatly packaged into 5 great sermons that we have in the Gospel of Matthew. The rest of his gospel is really anchored to those 5 great sermons, like the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, those kinds of messages. And so I suspect, and there's kind of a growing, it's a small minority, but a growing group of scholars who are seeing this, that what Matthew did was he may have actually produced something like pamphlets that included some of the sayings of Jesus. So here's one on the Sermon on the Mount, here's one on the Olivet Discourse. This kind of stuff would just circulate. And he would have written it in Aramaic. But then, when Mark's gospel gets produced, there's a growth in Matthew's readership beyond just Palestine, and it gets into Syria. And we have strong evidence that Matthew had an influence in Syria. So at that point, now we're starting to get some readers who are saying, we'd like to see what the historical context is for these saints. And so they are asking Matthew, can you put it in this kind of a context? Now, this is speculative, but I'm trying to put all of the data together from the early fathers in light of the external evidence that we have, as well as the internal evidence that we have. And so his audience has expanded, as we can see very plainly in his gospel, that Jesus is saying at the end, you're going to preach the gospel, you're going to make disciples of all the nations. Well, that's not just Jews. Matthew's gospel starts out as a very Jewish gospel. It ends up being a gospel to the Gentiles. And I think that that's where we start to see in his gospel this influence of wanting to get beyond just the Hebrew or the Aramaic community. and getting it to the broader audience, which would be in Greek. Okay, now you have Irenaeus, who says Matthew wrote first. Irenaeus wanted to have an apostle be the first author of one of the Gospels. It gives him more authority. I mean, we want to have an apostle be an authority, a writer of one of the Gospels, and to be the very first one. Man, that's a big deal. But Papias does not say that Matthew wrote a Gospel. Irenaeus comes after Papias, of course, and he's saying Matthew wrote this Gospel, and it's the first Gospel. I think Irenaeus was half right. Matthew wrote that Gospel. The external testimony of the Church Fathers is absolutely unanimous across the board for all four Gospels. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. There's no disagreement among these early fathers. So when Irenaeus says Matthew wrote Matthew, that's undisputed, at least as far as the fathers are concerned. But then he says, but he wrote first. Irenaeus had some things that were some wacky ideas about chronology, about the life of Jesus, the life of Paul and Peter and things like that. But he was pretty good in terms of authorship. So when you also read Papias, he talks about, and the other church fathers right on down the line, that Mark did not get his gospel from himself. He got it by following Peter. So here's one of the issues. People say, well, let's follow what the tradition says. Matthew wrote first. Well, that's Irenaeus' tradition, but that's not the oldest tradition. And when they say that, they are ignoring the other half of the tradition, that Mark got his gospel from Peter. Let me frame this. This is a lot of moving parts, and I'll try to make it simpler. If Matthew wrote first, those who hold to Matthean priority would say, surely Mark copied sections out of Matthew for his gospel. But how can that be if those same church fathers say that Mark got his gospel from Peter, not from Matthew? So you're buying half the tradition, not the other half of the tradition. But if Mark wrote first in Greek and Matthew wrote the sayings of Jesus in Aramaic, and as his ministry expanded into Greek-speaking areas, people said, we want to get a framework for these sayings. And so he used Mark's gospel essentially as that framework. Then it harmonizes with saying that Mark wrote the first gospel, Mark got his gospel from Peter, and Matthew also wrote a gospel. It's interesting that 600 of the 660 verses that are in Matthew are also in Mark. That's 90% plagiarism, if you want to consider it plagiarism. I think what he's doing is, as an apostle, he's putting his stamp of approval on what Mark has actually written. And there's some evidence that suggests that Luke is doing the same thing. So that would summarize what I'd say about this in terms of the external evidence. Let me just touch on another aspect of this. In Bart Ehrman's book, Forge, where he says the biblical writers are either pseudonymous or anonymous, we don't know who they are, but we got it all wrong. One of the things he talks about is how the internal evidence of how Matthew couldn't possibly have written Matthew. The Greek is really good, for one thing. Well, you'd expect that from a tax collector, wouldn't you? He's collecting taxes from Jews and Gentiles. The guy's going to be solidly bilingual. And so Ehrman says all are written by Gentiles. And he also says that that the internal evidence suggests that Matthew did not write Matthew, and he goes through with Luke and John as well. The problem is what he completely ignores is the patristic evidence. And it was Eusebius in the early 4th century who wrote ecclesiastical history or church history, whose primary occupation, it seemed, up until the time that he wrote that by the year 324, before he ever met Emperor Constantine, was to find out who wrote which books of the New Testament and to find out whether the church accepted these books. The Gospels were all accepted by the early churches as written by those people whose names are attributed to that in these very early manuscripts, not part of the Gospel, but you'll have in our oldest manuscripts that have Matthew chapter 1 or Mark or Luke or John chapter 1, they'll have a title there, according to John or according to Mark. So we know that from the very earliest time, those titles were added. What Ehrman doesn't do is he doesn't look at this external evidence, the patristic evidence, which is universally, almost universally, against his viewpoint. He ignores it because it doesn't help his case. You have to look at the internal evidence and the external evidence. These same church fathers say that Paul wrote these 13 letters, and the Greek fathers said Paul also wrote Hebrews. The Latin fathers disagreed with that. What's interesting is the church fathers have a lot of doubt about 2 Peter, but ultimately they accept it. So they're not just unanimous, slam dunk, here's the stamp, we approve this. This is by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And one other thing, if you want to have a gospel written by an apostle, you'd expect the early church to make up the idea of, oh, we have an apostle who wrote this gospel. But how do you explain the Gospel of Mark? Shouldn't it be called the Gospel according to Peter? I mean, after all, if Mark gets it from Peter, and this is the unanimous testimony of the ancient church fathers, then why isn't it called the Gospel according to Peter? Well, that tells us that because they're honest about that, we probably expect them to be honest about Matthew, Luke, and John as well, because they're not foisting this on a gospel. They're saying this is the early evidence that we have. There are some scholars who are even claiming now that those titles were part of the original gospels themselves.
That's excellent, and you actually in that answer addressed my third question, so I'm going to pass it over to William, who's been patiently waiting there. William, what kind of questions do you have for Dr. Wallace?
Dr. Wallace, what a blessing it is to be able to have you on. Love your background, love the conversation. It's fantastic. I do have a something that comes up very, very often. We hear it. In fact, right now I was taking a look at the chat, and I saw it come up a number of times, and I hear it brought up. Every time you get together and talk about theology, you talk about manuscript, textual evidence, and what have you. And now I want to ask you, do you think that the longer ending of Mark is part of the original? And then if it is not part of the original, does that affect us in any kind of way, in any negative way? Does it affect the Christian faith in any negative way?
Great
if it
question.
Is not part of the original?
One that is asked all the time, by the way, because we see that in our Bibles. It doesn't matter what Bible you open. Mark 16, verses 9 through 20 will be there. Now, it may be in brackets. It may be in smaller print. There may be a marginal note that says it's not in the oldest and best manuscripts, but it's still there. I call that a tradition of timidity. And that's because with our first Greek New Testament published on a printing press, the one by Erasmus back in March of 1516, he included the long ending of Mark's gospel, as well as the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now, Erasmus, in his annotations, said, I'm not really sure about these. There's patristic evidence against them, but he still included it in his Greek New Testament. Those annotations have been largely forgotten. It's his Greek text that has been well known. That Greek text stands almost directly behind the King James Bible, done almost 100 years later, 1611. The King James Bible has the long ending of Mark, and it has the story of the woman caught in adultery. These are the only two textual problems or textual variants in the entire New Testament that are more than 2 verses long, and both of them are 12 verses long. So let me just focus on the Mark 16 one. There have been some translations that were done where the scholars said, look, we're convinced this is not authentic, so let's dump it into the footnotes, not even have it in the text. And guess what happened? People who were used to seeing that in their Bible said, wait a minute, where's this long ending of Mark? We may not like it. We may not like the idea of picking up snakes and drinking poison and all this, but that's what the Bible says. So you're just getting rid of these statements in Scripture. You're anti-miracle or something like that. So they couldn't sell the Bibles. So Bibles have had to go in a different direction. With the Net Bible, I was the senior New Testament editor for the Net Bible, and we kept it in the text, but we reduced the font size by 2 points to make it harder to read from the pulpit. And we also put it in brackets with a lengthy footnote as to why we don't think it's authentic. So let me get into some of the reasons. First of all, the external evidence, I think, is very compellingly against it. our two oldest and what most scholars, not all, of course, but what most scholars would regard as our very best manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both from the middle of the 4th century. Both of them lack the long ending of Mark's Gospel. Now, Codex Vaticanus has a very interesting thing. It's got these little double dots in the margins in about 700 places they look like an umlaut or a diaresis, or when the way the British write the word cooperation, where you get those two dots over the second O. It's called a diaresis, or the way William does his Albrecht, which I don't know any German who would put the umlaut over an E, but you do.
They don't do it at all anymore. That is very outdated.
Before,
trust me, every time I go to Germany,
it was over the E before.
Excuse me?
What?
Ages ago. Now if you go to Germany, people see that and they think that that I've added it kind of like in a novel kind of way, but that it was done a long time ago. But it is not done at all anymore, and they'll look at you like, "What are you doing?" Trust me, every time I go to Munich or to anywhere in Germany and I show them my passport, they'll look at the two E's and they'll be like, they'll look at the two dots and they will wonder what on earth.
So it's kind of like Blue Oyster Cult, with their double dots. So, okay, so what were we talking about? Oh, I know. Codex Vaticanus has these two dots in the margin that a scholar by the name of Philip Payne discovered about 25 years ago were an indication of a known textual variant by the scribe. Now, scholars have debated that, whether that original scribe from the 4th century knew about these variants or not. But with all the debate, still there is a consensus that those double dots represent knowledge of a textual variant at that place. Here's the interesting thing. There are no double dots at Mark 16:8. It ends at Mark 16:8. There are no double dots there in Vaticanus, which means that if there were, we might say, hey, the scribe knew about it. We cannot say that the scribe knew about the long ending or did not, but at least we can say that there is no evidence that the scribe knew the long ending. Okay, now we have other ancient versions as well, like the Georgian and Armenian and Sahidic Coptic and others, were the earliest manuscripts. In the case of Armenian, the 99 earliest manuscripts have nothing after Mark 16:8. We have some manuscripts that put an asterisk in the margin, which indicates doubt about the authenticity of what follows, even though they have it. So here you're reading this manuscript, and it has it in there, but that asterisk has the same function as modern translations that say the oldest and best manuscripts don't have this. The ancients would understand that there's dispute about it. Modern readers hardly even look at the marginal notes. And so, when Bart Ehrman goes public and he gets on the Stephen Colbert show and others like that, he's done a shock show where he says, the story of the woman caught in adultery probably was added to John's gospel later. And everybody gets, oh my gosh, really Chicken Little kind of an attitude. They look at any Bible, they're going to have it in the marginal note. This was probably added later. It's not found in the oldest and best manuscript, something like that. It's just evidence. People don't read those marginal notes.
Yeah.
So, but these ancient scribes,
or they don't really read their Bible much at all.
Well, that's true too. Yeah. So it's probably that they just heard about the woman caught in adultery, but they've never really read the Bible. That's true. All right. So you've got that. You also have some manuscripts that say that Eusebius, the church father I mentioned earlier, canonized to Mark 16:8. But other manuscripts add the following. And so there's that marginal note where just a few manuscripts that go on and say, but other manuscripts add verses 9 through 20. And what do they mean by it? Eusebius canonized it to here? Well, Eusebius wrote what's called the Eusebian Canons, where he showed parallels between the various gospels. And that is an ingenious system that you still find in the front of printed Greek New Testaments from time to time. And what he was doing was showing if there's a parallel here in Mark, we find that it has parallel in Luke and Matthew, and all by a numerical system. It's just brilliant, absolutely amazing. Long before chapter and verse divisions. But there was nothing that Eusebius has from verses 9 through 20. And he even went so far as to say, I've looked at a great number of manuscripts, and I can hardly find these last 12 verses. Of course, he didn't call them that. They didn't have verse numbers yet. But I can hardly find this material in any manuscripts that I've ever looked at. Well, Eusebius had Constantine, the power of the Roman emperor behind him, to produce 50 Bibles for Byzantium or Constantinople. And you would think he would have access to a number of manuscripts. He had Origen's old library, Origen from the 3rd century, from Egypt. The man had just an incredible library of these ancient books. And you're saying, I can't find this in hardly any manuscripts. That's in the early 4th century. In the late 4th century, we get Jerome, who now has the Vatican behind him. And he's doing a translation of the Bible into Latin. And he says, there's hardly a Greek manuscript that has anything past verse 8. When you get to the 5th and 6th century, now it starts to come out that there's more and more manuscripts that do have this. But we don't have manuscripts quite that early, except just a couple that actually have the long ending. But what's happened is a patristic writer by the name of Victor of Antioch wrote a commentary, either late 5th or 6th century. It was the first commentary ever on the Gospel of Mark. And he included the long ending in that commentary. And what he said is, it sounds like it's fairly evenly distributed between which manuscripts have it, which don't. But today, the great majority of manuscripts do have the long ending. In terms of Greek manuscripts, we only have 2 that lack it, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So what was the majority in the 4th century is certainly not the majority today. And so you can't count noses and say, well, this is in the majority text, that's not going to work. It doesn't work with Eusebius. It doesn't work with Jerome, even though Jerome put it into his Latin Vulgate. But he said, I have serious doubts about its authenticity. So that's all that external evidence. And then when you look at the internal evidence, is it likely that Mark would have written this? It just doesn't line up. There have been some scholars who've tried to demonstrate this, but one of my doctoral students, a man by the name of Greg Sapaw, did his PhD dissertation on the wording, the vocabulary, the syntax, the theological motifs, the literary motifs in the long ending of Mark's gospel, and he compared it to some other endings that you probably don't even know about. And his conclusion was, the evidence is overwhelming. This stuff is not authentic. It doesn't match what Mark has written elsewhere. So when I look at all this evidence, I'll mention one other thing. There's actually 5 different endings for Mark's gospel. Did you know that?
I did not. No, I did not.
You knew the 2. It ends at verse 8 or it ends at verse 20. But then there's in one manuscript called the Freer insertion, or named after Charles Freer, the guy who discovered or purchased this manuscript in the early 20th century. Codex W. It's now at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It has a lengthy section, about a paragraph in length, between Mark 16, verse 14, and Mark 16, verse 15. Jerome mentions it. He says, I find this in some manuscripts. We did not know of any manuscripts until the beginning of last century, when a manuscript was actually produced that had what Jerome had discovered. And so that's a second ending. There's also a really very vanilla ending where the disciples find out, they hear Jesus preach and he says, go and give the news to everybody. It's a really vanilla ending. It's not nearly as interesting and as rich as verses 9 through 20. It's one of these, really, I'm yawning just listening to this. That ending is called the intermediate ending, or the shortest one ends at verse 8, but this intermediate ending, who would put that ending into the gospel if they already had verses 9 through 20? Bruce Metzger, one of the great textual scholars of the 20th century, said, no one. You put that in only if you don't have those last 12 verses. Now, it just so happens in the manuscripts where we have both of those endings, that intermediate ending always comes before verses 9 through 20, which suggests that in the tradition, somebody is copying, they find this intermediate ending, they put it in, and then they find the longer ending, And the basic scribal rule was, if in doubt, don't leave it out, So they put in verses 9 through 20 after that. So they, they're getting paid by the line. Why not? So, you have these various endings, and you ask a question: which would scribes be more likely to do? Would they be likely to drop these 12 verses that speak only in the last half of them about snakes, drinking poison, speaking in tongues, all this, starting in verse 17, I think? Or would they be likely to add it after verse 8, where if you end Mark's gospel at 16:8, it ends this way: that the angel told the women to go and tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee, and they did nothing because they were afraid. Period. End of the gospel. Now, on the surface, that is such a downer. Who on earth would ever end a gospel like that? It ends without an appearance of Jesus to the disciples. Now, the angel said that Jesus rose from the dead, so unless we want to discount the voice of an angel, we should probably believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and the women certainly did. Why would Mark end it that way? There have been two suggestions. One is that the actual ending that he wrote is completely lost. We don't have it anymore, but it's not those verses 9 through 20. Or Mark intended to end it at verse 8. I'm of the opinion that his intention was to actually end his gospel at 16:8. The arguments that the ending of the gospel is lost is that, well, this is, you have it written on a codex. A codex is our modern book form where it's bound on one side, and then cut on three sides, what a book looks like. That was actually invented in the middle of the 1st century AD. But it's also, it wasn't really picked up until a few decades later. Almost everyone believes that all of our New Testament books originally were written on a roll, or what people typically call a scroll. Now, by the 2nd century, we start getting codex form of book, and it was actually the Christians who promoted this more than any other religious group, any group of any sort. In the first 5 centuries AD, 94% of Christian literature was written on a codex, while only something like 14% of non-Christian literature was written on a codex. They were all written on rolls. So in the first, and I would say the only time in the history of the church, Christians were actually ahead of the technological curve. It's been 1,500 years since we were there, but nevertheless, the codex would not have been the original form of Mark. It would have been a roll. And what do you do? Well, you guys aren't probably even old enough to remember about where you could get the not DVDs, but the videotape. What's that called?
VHS.
VHS, yeah. And what was the store that was selling those?
A Blockbuster, Hollywood Video. We're old enough to know that.
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't keep up with that stuff. But
We're old enough.
I don't know if you
remember those.
They would charge you $1 if you didn't rewind that tape.
Yep.
Be kind, rewind.
$1.50. Yeah, $1.50 over here.
Oh, wow. Okay. Inflation. Yeah, that's what it does. But here's the thing. The same kind of attitude is true of the early rolls. We know among the religious rolls that we've seen of only one that was not rewound. That was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and for some reasons it was not rewound. You go through this roll, you get to the end, and then you roll it back up. So the beginning of the book is the outside. The end of the book, here's the point. The end of the book is the most protected part. So how in the world are you going to get the ending of Mark's gospel to be lost if it's the most protected part of the book? The only way that could happen is if it was originally written on a codex, or somebody forgot to rewind it, the very first one, and all the evidence is against both of those suppositions.
I had never heard that before. That's an incredible explanation, though.
Yeah, so it's out there. Scholars know about this, but they don't always talk about it. Let me give you you mind if I have some more evidence here?
Oh, definitely. Oh, yeah.
So there's some other arguments that have been used. I won't get into one of the Greek ones, but let me give some pushback on this. Some have said that the idea that Mark's gospel ends at verse 8 is really a modern invention. It's a Kafka kind of ending where we really do not have a positive ending. Nobody would really end a gospel like this in the ancient world. But there was a doctoral dissertation that demonstrated this very thing, that it's an open-ended conclusion is what it is. For they were afraid is how the gospel ends. And the Greek verb there is in the imperfect. It's ephobunta, which means for they continued to be afraid. Even the very form says this is open-ended. And I take it that what Mark is doing is he's writing his gospel in such a way to get the readers to step right into the shoes of these early disciples and not be afraid and proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. They were suffering persecution, and this was something that they should do. It's nothing against the women, of course, but what you see in Mark's gospel, throughout the gospel, is you see people and demons who are told by Jesus, do not speak his name anywhere else, and all these people go out and do exactly the opposite. And at the end, the angel says, now do speak his name, tell others about him, and they don't do it. So it's irony in the end, as one author put it. What's interesting is I think Mark even gives us a clue that he's going to do this. And it's the very first verse of his gospel. He says in verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He doesn't call it the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's the beginning of the gospel. Now, what we discover is that a lot of ancient books, an awful lot of them, take that first line from their work, and that is the title of the book. What if Mark meant for this to be the title? And I think Luke understood what Mark was doing, and he was replicating it in his 2-volume work, Luke Acts. You notice in Acts chapter 1, Luke says that, now concerning the things, Theophilus, that Jesus began to do and to teach in the first book that I wrote you. Wait a minute. Began to do and to teach? I thought this is what Jesus did and taught. No, he began to do and to teach those things, and this ministry is carried on by the Spirit of God working in the apostles. So Jesus is continuing to do and to teach these things in the book of Acts. And then the end of the book of Acts, Luke does the same thing that Mark does. He has 8 chapters leading up to this trial where Paul is supposed to be before Caesar, and the whole book ends with a downer. Paul's in prison, house arrest for 2 years, spreading the gospel, but he never gets to see Caesar. Luke, that's a terrible ending. You got a cliffhanger here, and you just kind of shut off and say, intermission, by the way, we're not coming back. I mean, some have said, if he did this on purpose, the guy's an idiot. No, what he's doing is the same thing that Mark was doing. Disciples, you step in, and are you going to continue to proclaim the gospel about Jesus Christ? Some have even argued that Theophilus, the man to whom Luke was writing, was actually a court-appointed lawyer to defend Paul in his imprisonment, and that Luke was preparing a trial brief. A very interesting book has come out recently that argued that Donald Hagner at Fuller Seminary thinks is absolutely marvelous. I think he's right. I think that Luke is doing something where he's emulating Mark. He got that idea from Mark of an open-ended conclusion, and he does that in this very book of Acts where he's saying, Theophilus, I want you to write chapter 29. Get Paul out of prison so he can continue the gospel. Okay, that's my pitch.
No, that was amazing, Dr. Wallace. That was incredible. I was going to ask you, and I know that it's something that is on Michael's mind as well, and everybody's mind. What do you believe would be the strongest critique against the skeptics who claim we cannot know anything of what the originals actually said and taught?
It's hard to know where to start with this question. There are so many critiques. The first thing I guess I'd say is it's a self-defeating critique.
Yep.
If you say that about the New Testament, you have to apply that across the board with all ancient Greco-Roman literature, across the board. We have, on average, more than 1,000 times as many manuscripts for the New Testament as the average classical Greek or author has in terms of what is extant, what exists still today. More than 1,000 times. You take the average classical Greek or Latin author and you stack up all the copies we have of them over the centuries that still exist, be about 15 copies, about 4 feet high at the very most, maybe even 3 feet high. You stack up the New Testaments in all the languages, just like I'm comparing apples with apples. You take this with classical authors, whatever their books have been translated into, and the stack becomes 1.25 miles high of all these copies of the New Testament, handwritten copies in Greek and all the other languages it was translated into from a very early period. That's an embarrassment of riches. I mean, classical scholars would die to have the problem that New Testament scholars have of so much material to sift through. But it's not just the amount of material we have, it's the date of the material. The average classical author we're waiting about half a millennium to a millennium before we get a single copy of the average classical author's writings. So you get, say, Herodotus or Xenophon's Hellenica. We are literally waiting 18 centuries before we get a fairly large copy. We have small fragments until that time. Here he is, 4th, 5th century BC. We're waiting 1,800 years before we get any copies of substantial length of his material. If the New Testament were in that situation, Xenophon's no schmeal, he was a well-known historian. If we face that same kind of situation for the New Testament, it would be like saying that apart from some small scraps of papyrus, we are waiting until the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane before we see a substantial copy of the New Testament. Now, if that were the case, I think the skeptics would have a point. You move that back to when we actually do have these early copies. Our earliest complete copy in one manuscript for the New Testament is Codex Sinaiticus, middle of the 4th century, about 350. To get a complete copy of these other ancient writers, you almost never do get a complete copy. But when you do, you're waiting 12, 13, 1400, 1500 years before you get that kind of thing. And by the 4th century, we have well over 100 copies of the New Testament. Most of them are fragmentary, but we have Vaticanus, which is most of the New Testament. So is Sinaiticus. By the 5th century, we have others that are almost complete New Testaments. Just a massive amount of material. But it's not just the 4th century. You go back, let's say, to within a century of when the New Testament was completed, 2nd century AD. We have now as many as 12 to 15 papyrus fragments from the 2nd century of the New Testament. Our earliest one, P52, was traditionally dated about 100 to 150. It's of John's Gospel, just 5 verses out of John. On one side, it's a couple verses in John 18, 31 through 33. And on the back side, John 18, verses 37 and 38. This demonstrated that it was written on a codex because, both sides, for one thing, a roll they'd only write on the inside. And this is on both sides. And it's so close to each other, both from the same chapter. We even know the size of the page and the size of the manuscript, how many leaves it had. Scholars have just poured over this small fragment that's about the size of a credit card.
Yeah.
But it's within decades of when John wrote his gospel. Most scholars say he wrote it in the 90s. You have a copy of John's gospel that surely would have been a complete copy originally within 50, 60 years, maybe within 10 or 20 years of that original. How dare you? What else do we have in the ancient world that even comes close to that? You're just going to hear crickets if you ask that question, because we don't. It's amazing when people talk this way. They are talking about the New Testament without having any clue about what else is going on in the ancient Greco-Roman world. So my second issue with them is that they're terribly myopic. They simply want to attack the New Testament. They don't want to look at all the evidence for everything else. And when they begin to, what often happens is they become Christians, like Lee Strobel did.
Yeah.
An atheist, and he looks at the others, I can't disagree with this. And what's also interesting is even the scholars, guys like Bart Ehrman, who will say, we don't know what the original New Testament said. We're waiting for copies and copies and copies before we get anything. I'm not sure how he knows how many copies we're waiting for. At the same time, it's interesting. In virtually every book he has written, apart from those that deal specifically with the text of the New Testament, he'll cite from the New Testament without any question as to what it says. And he'll cite from Greco-Roman authors without any question as to what they say. When our earliest copies might be 1,500 years later. But there's no doubt that Plato really said this, because my one copy from AD 1000 says it. He doesn't question those things. How could he question the New Testament without questioning the other? So my final argument would be, if you really believe this, to be consistent, then we need to go back into the Dark Ages, because we have to throw out everything that started the Renaissance, which is a recovery of the ancient Greek literature that starts before the fall of Constantinople. But by AD 1453, when the Turks invaded Constantinople, the Muslims did, under the Ottoman Empire, they took it over. All these monks and scribes fled into the rest of Europe and brought with them their Greek manuscripts, both of ancient Greek literature and of the New Testament. And the Renaissance got a huge kick in the derriere to keep moving, and the Reformation got its start precisely because of this. That's what gave it the material start for the Reformation, which said, ad fontes, let's get back to the sources. Now we actually have the sources we can get back to.
Dr. Wallace, what an incredible answer. I have one more thing that I want to pick your brain on, and then I want to pass it over to my brother, Michael. So hopefully we can get to a chat or two. But Dr. Wallace, I know that today is the first time you've been on the show. God willing, you'll be on more times in the future. But believe it or not, your name has come up more than once before, my friend.
Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah. Shabir Ali says that you admit that John 1:1, where the word is called God, is qualitative, so that it should be divine, but that he is not God in an absolute sense. Dr. Wallace, is this properly representing you?
You know, I'm shocked that Shabir Ali would say that, because doesn't he have a bachelor's degree in biblical studies?
Yep.
He's supposed to be an Islamic exegete. In other words, he's supposed to know how to understand the words that somebody writes and their context. And I spend 15 pages in my Greek grammar talking about what's called Caldwell's rule and its relevance for John 1:1 in my grammar that's about 850 pages long. And he should know better than to say those things. He's half right. I do say that it is qualitative, and that means that it should be translated perhaps as divine. Now, frankly, if I say it's translated divine, that in no way is suggesting that Jesus is less than full deity. In fact, what it does is it says he's different from the Father. That's what that qualitative force means. You've got Jehovah's Witnesses who say Trinitarians will argue that in the beginning was the Word. They say, okay, they say that's the second person of the Trinity, and the Word was with God. Well, they say the first person of the Trinity, and the Word was God. Well, how can the second person be the same as the first person? And so they go through this. They have this little pamphlet that's been distributed for decades, where they say Trinitarians have confusing math. Well, I'd say they are really, really confused about what we're actually saying. It goes back to Origen, it goes back to Eusebius, it goes back to Martin Luther. A whole history of scholars, church fathers and scholars have said, essentially, this is what I think Luther says. The word order here in Greek is such that it affirms Trinitarian theology, that the Father and the Son have exactly the same essence, but they are not the same person. If the order had been the Word was the God, where you actually have the article the in front of God, that would be Sabellianism. That is, the Word is the same as the Father.
Yep.
But if you have, what you actually have in Greek is theos, God, ein, was, hologos, the Word. But Greek grammar requires the article, the noun with the article to be the subject, so it should be translated, the Word was God. But God, the predicate nominative, is thrown forward in the sentence for emphasis. If it were to come after the verb, then that would be Arianism, as Luther says. If it came after the verb, it would mean the word was a God. What John writes is against Arianism and against Sabellianism. And what I like to say is that what John wrote here in 4 words is the most concise way he could possibly have written that Jesus Christ is essentially the same as the Father in his being, but not identical in his person. It's a beautiful statement. And to say that he is any less than full deity is that's a rather improper and biased reading of what I've written. I mean, anybody who reads anything I've written knows that I am a strong defender of the deity of Christ. And by the way, the reason I am, you guys don't know this. When I made a commitment to Christ at age 16, I grew up in Newport Beach, California, and I was a body surfer and played football and a bunch of other things. And I made this commitment to Christ then. And I started picking up New Testaments, today's English version, which existed way back then. Good News for Modern Man. And I buy them by the boxload from this real estate office in Costa Mesa, the town right next to where I lived. And this guy had a big billboard on his real estate office. It said, Jesus saves. He was a solo realtor, didn't work with anybody else, and so he could do this. So I thought, oh, here's a Christian. I'm going to go talk to him. I was just, really excited about being a Christian. And I go and I'd buy these. I'd get them for 25 cents a piece, these New Testaments, paper New Testaments, if I'd buy a box load of them. So I'd do that. I'd drive up and down Coast Highway, pick up hitchhikers. This is back in the 60s. Still wasn't altogether safe, but that's what I did. I'd give these to people, and every 3 or 4 weeks I'd come back and say, I need another box so I can share the gospel with people. Well, this man, Brother Michael is what he called himself, said, by the way, did you know that Jesus is not God? I said, what are you talking about? And show me in today's English version places where he thought it was saying that Jesus is not true deity. Now it caused a crisis for me. I thought, if I'm committing my life to Jesus Christ, then I want to know that he's worthy of that kind of a commitment. Because at 16 years old, I said, I am going to do, for the rest of my life, I'm going into full-time Christian service. I'm not going to plan for anything else. I come from a whole family of genius engineers. Ministry was not something they thought about. So I started studying Greek in college as a teenager so I could get an answer to that question. Is Jesus true deity? I wrote my doctoral dissertation on this very thing. And it has to do with what's called Granville-Sharp's rule. And the dissertation is Granville.
Great book.
Oh, thank you. You have it. You've read it.
I sure do. More than once I've read it.
Oh, you're the one. I'm glad to hear that. Dissertations, they're not cheap. It's like $90 for this thing. But C.F.D. Moll, who was the Lady Margaret Chair of Divinity at Cambridge University, read the dissertation, and he said, he was not an evangelical, but he said, I think you have proved once and for all that in these 2 passages where Granville-Sharp's rule applies and speaks about Jesus, he is called God. There is no doubt in my mind. That's pretty great commendation, I would think, So, here was a guy who knew his Greek well, and he still recognized that the New Testament calls Jesus God. So that's been kind of my life story of why I got into Greek. It's because of the deity of Christ and questioning whether this is true. So Shabir Ali, he should know better than that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Wallace. I recall during our debate when he mentioned that, I remember just thinking, Dr. Wallace believes in the deity of Christ. I'm quite certain you're misunderstanding him. But anyways, there was a lot to deal with, so I didn't get to tackle that one. So I'm glad you were able to clarify that. All right, here's a couple questions from the audience. What do you think about Q?
Wasn't that on Star Trek?
Yeah, not the character Q. I was thinking the same thing.
Q as in Quella, or the German word for source. For those who don't, I don't know much about your show. I'm sorry to say, guys. So you have some pretty sophisticated listeners who are going to ask that kind of question right off the bat. I'm impressed. Q.
Yeah.
And it's my fault that I don't know that much about your show. Nothing against you. You know, got
That's
my nose
okay.
too much buried. The Q is a
No problem.
construct that scholars have come up with that is essentially saying the material that Matthew and Luke share that is not found in Mark, about 250 verses, a little bit more than that, where they parallel each other. They're saying almost exactly the same thing, but what they're saying is not found in Mark. It must go back to a common source that is other than one of those two gospels. In other words, Luke didn't use Matthew. Matthew didn't use Luke, but both of them used this source called Q. Now, this goes back to what's called the two-source hypothesis, which is that Matthew and Luke used two sources. They used Mark and Q to write their gospels. That has been expanded to what's now called the four-source hypothesis. For 100 years, it's been called we've had a four-source hypothesis, that Matthew had his own special material and Luke had his own special material. I frankly do believe that there was such a thing as Q. And the majority of New Testament scholars, I think, would believe that there was this. Is it a written document? In part, I suspect so. Is it an oral? Is it oral sayings that just kind of passed into oral tradition? In part, I suspect it was that as well. The wording is too similar, and some other things are just too similar to suggest that it was just oral tradition. I think it was a combination of things that we would call Q. Some said, well, why don't we have Q anymore? Well, why don't we have those pamphlets that Matthew wrote on the sayings of Jesus? Why don't we have the sources that Luke said that he used? He said he uses sources, plural. One of them we think is Mark. There are a few scholars that say, well, Luke used Mark and Matthew. The problem with that is that Matthew's theology seems to be more, I don't want to say more advanced. Luke has much more primitive wording than Matthew does. Matthew elaborates and expands and puts in these introductory quotations from the Old Testament that Luke doesn't have. And so it's hard for me to see Luke using Matthew. But if he says he used sources, then if Mark's one of them, we could call the other one Q. And that happens to be the material that Matthew and Luke both agree on.
Yeah, when people ask, why don't we have these things? I think of the Old Testament. Why don't we have the sayings of the prophet Edo and a few others that, we clearly don't have. All right. So this one is from Lewis, who's a contributor here on the show. Is it possible that Mark wrote the longer ending, but that he did so later than the rest of the gospel as a sort of postscript? And this explains why some manuscripts lack it.
Well, when you're dealing with historical data, I would hate to say that something is impossible. We're not dealing with test tube science, but we're talking about things that, well, we don't have all of the data to examine. But I can say this, it is highly unlikely that Mark did such a thing. If he intended to end his gospel at 16:8, then he did so for a particular literary and theological reason, to get people in gear to be bold about their commitment to Jesus Christ, essentially saying, are you prepared for the cost? It goes all the way back to the fulcrum of Peter's confession. Peter says, you are the Messiah, you're the Christ. And then Jesus tells him what it means to be the Christ. And Peter says, wait a minute, that's not my vision of what you're supposed to do. What I meant is you're going to be a military conqueror. You're supposed to kick some Roman butt. Jesus, get on the stick and do this. And that's, it's interesting. This happens right after the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida. That this blind man, Jesus spit in his eyes. He saw partially, but not completely. You go, wait a minute, Jesus could raise somebody from the dead. Couldn't he heal a blind man? It took him 2 tries to get it right. That was meant to be an object lesson to the disciples. And so Peter makes this confession that Jesus is the Christ, but he doesn't really fully understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. He's not going to be a conquering hero. He's going to die in the place of the rest of us. And so Peter has a partial understanding. He's half blind still, just like that blind man was. And it's not until we come to the recognition that we must accept him in his sacrifice before we can see him in his resurrection, that we can fully grasp who Jesus is. And that's what the women are, they become symbolic of all Christians. We have to accept that sacrifice, which they did. And they were the first ones to actually see him raised from the dead. But that would be my first argument, is it doesn't fit into the literary motif. Now, let's say I'm wrong about Mark ending it at 16:8. Then he had a different ending. And scholars would say that, a lot of scholars would say, yeah, he had some different ending. Why don't they say Mark 16:9 through 20 is the ending? Because it doesn't fit Mark's vocabulary, it doesn't fit his syntax, it doesn't fit his style of writing, it doesn't fit his literary motifs, it doesn't fit his theological motifs. In other words, it looks like somebody else stuck this on the end of the Gospel of Mark, which is exactly what I think happened.
All right, now the next one here. Who wrote John? The presbyter John of the Apostle? Richard Bauckham believed it's the presbyter John.
The presbyter John or the apostle?
Yeah, I think that's what he meant, of instead of, or I'm sorry, instead of, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that the person said the presbyter John, the elder John. He's often called John the elder or John the presbyter, but that actually is not what the Greek says. Now, if you're identifying, and we're talking about Papias in particular, who talks about him this way. And it's Papias' statement where he talks about how he would rather listen to the living word about who Jesus was than read it in books. And he talks about the Lord's disciples, and he mentions John the apostle. And then right after that, he talks about the elder John, and Aristion, I think, was the other one. Now, what Papias is not doing, I don't think he's making a distinction between John the apostle and the elder John. In Greek, if you're going to identify somebody with another noun, you give a proper name, and then you're going to say, well, which one are we talking about? Michael, the archangel, that Michael I'm talking about. John, the apostle, but not the apostle John. That's not how they would typically do it, unless it's already somebody well known. This is an introduction to the elder John. Well, you'd expect it to be John the elder in Greek, but that's not the word order. And the first time we see him, he's the elder John. That's how Papias refers to him. I think what he's saying is John the apostle was one of Jesus' disciples. And later, John the old man John, the same John, but now he's an old man, has continued to share this testimony with others. So I would disagree with Bauckham. Eusebius interprets Papias to mean there are two Johns, one the elder John, or John the elder, and John the apostle. Eusebius doesn't want it to be John the apostle, though. And here's the reason why. Because Eusebius, 4th century writers, as we've talked about already, did not believe in chiliasm. He did not believe there would be a millennial kingdom, a kingdom that lasts for 1,000 years. So he didn't like Papias. He kind of calls him, here's a man of very little brain. He really poo-poos him, but he's still, the only way we know anything of what Papias wrote is because Eusebius quotes him. It's called the Fragments of Papias, not that his body was flailed, but the fragments of Papias's writings, that Eusebius quotes. But he wants to distance Papias from John the Apostle, I think. Now, this is my opinion. Not by no means is this is a consensus, but it's there are a number of scholars who would agree with this. He wants to distance himself from John the Apostle, that is, distance the book of Revelation from John the Apostle, because to Eusebius, that book is hard for him to explain as not having a 1,000-year kingdom. Now, when he talks about the book of Revelation, he says some don't regard it as authentic, others do, in terms of being inspired. He knows that somebody by the name of John wrote it, but whether it was the apostle Eusebius, I think he waffles on that one. So there's reasons why he would read Papias the way he does, but I am grateful that he quotes Papias accurately, so that as you actually look at what Papias says, it'd say, no, Eusebius, I know your Greek is good, but I think you missed it on this point, and perhaps intentionally.
Does Eusebius include the book of Revelation in the canon?
He does.
A blank. He does. Okay.
Yeah, and this is in book 3, chapter 15 is where he talks about that. But he kind of waffles. He says some want it to be. It's in there. And others, he calls it the Antilegomena, and then it's not pseudepigrapha because somebody named John wrote it, either the old man John or John the Apostle. But it's hard for him to tell, but he would still include it in the one of the 27. But I think, if I recall correctly, he doesn't think the Apostle John wrote it.
Last one. Kyle asks, is it possible that Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus had the whole Bible in it, as they are missing certain books?
Yes. Almost everybody agrees. They had the whole Bible in them originally, just like Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus from the 5th century and Codex Alexandrinus, also from the 5th century, were originally whole Bibles in Greek. And Vaticanus, in fact, both Vaticanus and Sinaiticus have quite a bit of the Old Testament in them, as does Alexandrinus, and Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus far less so. But they had portions that covered both testaments that suggest to virtually everybody these were codices that in one or perhaps two volumes originally had the entire Bible in them. It's pretty impressive. If you go to the Vatican's website, you can see, well, you can just type in Codex Vaticanus and ask for images. You'll see I think it's like 6 inches thick, the actual book. I had an opportunity with a colleague of mine to spend a week looking at Codex Vaticanus at the Vatican back in 2001. It was 6 hours every day for a week. Man, I was having Christmas every day. That was just awesome. They just don't let people get to look at that, but that was a lot of fun. I mean, it's a thick book, and yet the pages are about as thin as our paper today. I mean, it's very finely created or crafted vellum.
Oh, now Sinaiticus there. Some say that maybe this was commissioned during the reign of Constantine, that he allegedly had some Bibles commissioned, and they've suggested this is one of them. What do you think of that?
It's a popular theory that some scholars hold to. T.C. Skeet, who was at the British Library or the British Museum, actually, when Codex Sinaiticus was brought in there on December 27th, 1933, he was assistant librarian. He lived till he was about 100. He published till he died just about. He believed that these were 2 of the 50 Bibles that Constantine had commissioned Eusebius in his workshop in Caesarea Maritima to work on. One of the reasons why is because Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are the only Greek New Testaments that we have that are written in 3 or 4 columns. All the others are 1 or 2 columns. Mm-hmm. Now, the instructions we have, Eusebius kept a portion of the instructions that Constantine gave him about creating these Bibles. And he said, I want these Bibles to be put in 3s and 4s. What does that mean? There have been at least a dozen theories as to what 3s and 4s represents. But perhaps it is more than coincidence that these are the only 2 Bibles, the only 2 Greek New Testaments that are in 3 and 4 columns, and that he says 3s and 4s, and that they are the only ones that could be early enough to be dated, parchment manuscripts, early enough to be dated to be those. I don't think they are. I think these manuscripts are the next generation, and I think one of Constantine's sons commissioned Athanasius to produce them. And whether that's both of them or not, that's harder for me to tell. But it's a good theory, good hypothesis. It may be that these were actually 2 of the 50 Bibles commissioned, but I don't think so. I talk about it. I mean, it's always interesting, and just to be able to touch history like that. Of course, we're touching history before that, but it's fascinating.
Indeed. Dr. Wallace, we are so happy to have you on, and you're welcome on anytime. I understand that you might be coming on again in the future. We'd love to have you.
Great. Well, thank you.
And go ahead and put in a plug for anything that we can look forward to. Any books that are coming out or anything new?
Oh, yeah. Hendrickson Publishing House just last month came out with a 2-volume set of facsimiles, photographic images of 3 of the earliest New Testament papyri that CSNTM photographed. It's P45, P46, and P47. We photographed them in 2013 and 2014 at 2 different locales, one in Dublin, one in Michigan. And these are putting these photographs into one, well, it's 2 volumes because each volume has all 3 of these papyri. P45 has the Gospels and Acts portions of it. P46 is our oldest manuscript of Paul's letters, and it's got most of the pages that were originally there, 86 of the original 104 pages, and most of them are fairly complete. It's just astounding how much material we have there. And then P47 is of Revelation. Again, all of these are fragmentary, as all papyri are. They're not complete documents, but they're all 3rd century. Among the very earliest manuscripts we have. Oldest for Paul, oldest for Mark, oldest for portions of the other Gospels and Acts, and oldest for Revelation for the portions it has. That's just stunning. We photograph these against a white background and against a black background. Now, New Testament papyri have typically been photographed against a white background, but papyrologists and those who are doing this kind of digitization recognize that a black background brings out different things. And so we did both, and they just came out this last month. It's a 2-volume set, very handsome, and it's full size. They had to make the pages big enough for the biggest leaf of all 3 of these papyri. And so sometimes on a page, there's going to be just a small scrap of papyrus, and the whole rest of it is black ink, because they had to make it big enough for the biggest one. But these facsimiles are state-of-the-art stuff. We are finding literally thousands of differences from the only other published transcription done back in the 1930s by Frederick Kenyon. Thousands of differences from his transcription, and we are starting to produce our own transcriptions. We have one of P47. Hendrickson is selling that too. It's you can get these, frankly, at either Hendrickson or at CSNTM, my organization. But if you get it from CSNTM, same price, it's a discounted price of $299. You get all 3 of the editors to sign them. They don't have that at Hendrickson. So I'd say, hey, come to CSNTM, buy our copies. It's pricey, I realize that, but this is not something that you get for every day. And it's something that I would recommend churches get for their pastors who really want to study the text in the original. I think they absolutely love this set.
Yeah, and I want to encourage everybody to go to csntm.org. I'm glad you mentioned it because I'd love to have you on to just talk about it. Just talk about what you're doing there. The Center for for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. That would be incredible. I'd love to hear more. So let's do it again.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on, William. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Wallace. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to talking to you again.
Love the icons. You all have a Merry Christmas.
Thank you all. Y'all too. And everyone, thank you for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Also, check us out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you would like to support us. Until next time, God bless you all.